Joining. Thanks, Paulina. Thanks, everyone, for joining to the Data Stewards Trends to Watch, the June session. And as you can see, Paulina has added some nice weather and spring symbolic figures to today's session. I hope everyone is doing well. And again, delighted to be able to join you all and reflect on what has happened the last few months that might be good to know or might be interesting to know as it relates to data stewardship. And so I will cruise through some of the developments, and as always, hope to have also some time to have a broader conversation. So let's dive in. From my perspective, there are a few recent developments that might be interesting to know. And the first one that I've curated for today is kind of a few recent developments as it relates to new measurement techniques to measure the value of data. As you all know, and many of you who were part of the Data Stewards Bootcamp, one of the perennial questions that, of course, we have when it comes to data is how do we know what is the value of data and how do we start measuring the value of data? And there were two interesting developments that, or two interesting papers that were published recently. One last, or actually this week, and the other one was kind of a paper that was referred to in the Economist that tried to kind of capture a way to understand what was the value. And the first one was a paper that was published in the National Bureau of Economic Research Working Paper series that basically tries to understand what is the economic impact of data and how do you go about measuring it. And so what they've developed was kind of a model where they started looking at data as a intangible asset and try to learn how do you measure the value of intangible assets. And so they leveraged that literature and also leveraged the kind of the methodology. But what was interesting that they also added an additional component where they looked at data as kind of a pricing mechanism as well, because many people shed data and then they get something back in return. So it's actually a bartering activity, right? Where you could actually try to understand what is the value of the bartering, where you actually share some data and you get something back, quite often for free, but ultimately it has a value. And so what they developed was kind of this new, what is called an output-based model to measure the value of data. And they came to the realization that much of the value is not on the books, right? So it's kind of the missing value. It's not measured, and as a result, we don't actually know. But it came to the realization that using this method, it's about 1.5% GDP of the US GDP that is embedded in data. Now, if you look at the US GDP, that translates in about 480 billion per year that is actually not measured, and that is the result of having access to data and stewarding data in ways that creates economic value. And so that's kind of one new data point that again makes the point that data is a extremely valuable asset in society. Unfortunately, quite often we don't have a way to capture it. The other, and of course, I do have to say, is that this was mainly focused on the economic value, right? So it didn't measure what was the value of data for instance, making better decisions in government, or how was the value of data to save lives during a pandemic, for instance, right? So this was mainly focused on kind of the value for corporations and how that would translate in their accounting if you would start measuring it as an intangible asset, or if you would start measuring it as kind of a pricing activity. You get something from individuals as such. The other methodology was also quite interesting, and basically this was an attempt to measure the impact of statistics and and as a data source. And again, as many of you know, statistics, and especially we will talk about that later as well, is kind of at a anyway at a critical turning point where there's a lot of kind of trust in statistics that is disappearing. And there's a lot of discussion about what is the value of actually official statistics. And many official statistics agencies have a difficult time to actually document the value. And so this is an interesting research that tries to understand what is the cost of statistics, what is the value of statistics based upon what happens if you don't have statistics. And so they basically looked at kind of what happened when there was um, a skirmish in the US when at a certain point in time the business statistics was basically undermined by a tweet by Trump who basically dismissed the official statistical number. And then what they looked at was to basically say what was the impact of dismissing trust in statistics as it relates to, for instance, economic policy uncertainty. And what they saw was that there was actually a loss of 100 billion as a result of economic uncertainty, right? So there was less investment. There was also economic confidence, and consumer confidence went down as a result of not being able to have official statistics that you can trust. And so this was another way to start measuring kind of the impact of data. And they were saying that it's almost like 10 to 1, $1 being invested. No, actually 25 to 1. $1 being invested, you get actually a return of $25, which is quite amazing if you think about anyway the value of having trusted statistics on the economy, on the investment climate that subsequently emerges from having trust in statistics. So that's kind of an interesting, I would say, an interesting data point again to show the value of data and also what happens if you don't have trusted data and the implications of that on kind of the economy, on the kind of uncertainty that exists as a result of not having access to data. Now, the interesting thing is that because a lot of the focus here, especially the first one, was focused on data as an asset, what was also interesting is that actually the first country that developed legislation to establish a data as an asset was in the Isle of Man. And what happened there, and let me see if I can go to the. So what happened is that they created legislation to be able to set up what they call data asset foundations, where you basically set up a foundation to manage the data as an asset, and then also be able to monetize that asset. And it's one of the first, anyway, like in Europe, there's a lot of focus on data spaces. But here, the Isle of Man is basically innovating the whole concept of data as an asset and how we then manage that. Now, the interesting aspect is that they have also a whole range of roles, including, as you can see, if you set up a data asset, then there is a mandatory function of a data stewardship, right? So you actually do need to have a data steward on staff in order to manage the data as an asset. And there are all kinds of other elements that are there as well. And so if you look, for instance, at the roles that are required to set up a data asset foundation, then you have a founder, you have a dedicator that basically you dedicate access to. But also, as you can see, they have a business data steward that is mandatory to have in order if you have a data asset foundation, and you also have then a other kind of roles as well. And so I thought this was interesting because what they try to do in the Isle of Man, is to actually come up with a new innovative way to then start valuing data, right? Because once you have a data asset foundation, you can also start valuing data and also start monetizing some of the data that you didn't have there before as well. So that's another element that I wanted to indicate as kind of the whole development of how do we understand the value of data, but also how do we then manage the value of data. And so here, the data asset foundation is kind of a way where data is clearly seen as not just an intangible asset, but also as property that can be managed as an asset in a way that can be monetized and valued as well. Now, in addition to, of course, the value, and as you know, there is an ongoing indication of what I have called the data winter, where while we understand the value of data, we also see ongoing extraction of data in ways that doesn't create shared benefit, but we also see the kind of decline of having access to data. And so one paper that was published was again around official statistics by Paris 21, which is an organization based at the OECD that basically tries to support official statistics as they are transforming themselves. And so the paper basically indicates that official statistics is kind of at a point of a turning point, a crossroads, where on the one hand, trust in official statistics is going down, but on the other hand, of course, AI could be seen as a tool to improve official statistics as well. And so I highly recommend, if you're interested in that, recommend reading the paper. The other element that is here is that where we actually see national security, but also sovereignty, which is a topic that we will see is becoming more and more pronounced in the data space as well, where we see, of course, that national security is also now leading to less access to data. And of course, this is the case here where imagery, satellite imagery, disappeared or was not available, mainly because of the conflict in Iran, but also other conflicts basically means that private sector satellite providers are now mandated to switch off access to some of the satellite feeds. And so that also contributes to kind of the ongoing data winter as well, where we actually see that less access to satellite data because of conflicts. Now, other elements that I curated here was kind of the concern. As you know, there's a concern on how data is being scraped. And on the one hand, that could be a concern that, of course, has a valid concern that you don't want your data to be scraped. And there is more and more, right, in order to prevent extraction, there's more and more technical means to prevent scraping of the public web, which again leads to a data winter. And that includes robotext, of course, as kind of a device that limits access to the public web or its capture and so on. But quite often this is done in order to prevent scraping, in order to make sure that this is not extracted. But then, of course, others might also be harmed from that. And that includes, for instance, the Wayback Machine. As you all know, Internet Archive is one of the great initiatives that exists that tries to create an archive of the internet, right? By scraping the internet, right? In a way so that you can go back or way back on how did the website look like in 1997, or how did the website look like anyway yesterday. And so a great service for research, but also a great service to basically capture the evolution of the public web. But what we see in an attempt to prevent scraping, it also means that the Wayback Machine is also limited in actually being able to archive the internet in ways that then later could be researched or in ways that could be accessed as well. And so you always have to be sensitive, of course, on the one hand, especially when it comes to news sites. And I will show the data tank has research on anyway understanding this extractive behavior of scraping news content, but you cannot just close it because then, for instance, other services like the Internet Archive are then also limited in how they go about providing a service. Same thing happened again in the US, where kind of a very important scientific effort to monitor the oceans is now also being dismantled. And so we see this constant decline in data collection or also in actually accessing data for public interest purposes as well, which has led some authors, including Alice Young, to reflect on whether we are not only entering a data winter, but also entering a data nihilistic kind of environment where consumers actually don't care anymore about how the data is being leveraged, but also might have negative impact on how responsible actors have access to data or deal with data as well. So that's kind of the value of data, and then ultimately also developments as it relates to the decline of certain data sources and the decline of having access to data, and also kind of the changing temperament with regard to how people reflect on their data and how they want to have their data being used. Now, what we see happening is, of course, and that's something that we discussed at length at other times as well, is of course, how do we then keep on providing access to data? And so there are a few developments in the context of licensing. Here, this is an effort by the National Archives in the UK that has done quite a really interesting piece that I recommend everyone, if you're interested in open licensing, on how some of the concerns that they have seen among their users on how open licensing quite often is confusing. And sometimes users don't really know how to deal with open licensing, how you actually can leverage it. And so this report basically takes stocks of it's great to have open license, but in some cases it doesn't work for certain kind of content. And in some cases, people don't really know how to use it as well. And the same, because this is ultimately the constant tension, right, between, on the one hand, making data open, licensing in a way that it actually can be leveraged, but then also, again, preventing extraction, because this is kind of the increased concern that many have, especially as a result of AI extractive behavior. And so one organization, of course, that is at the center of this discussion about how do we keep content open, but also how do we do it in a way that is responsible, that it actually doesn't undermine the data commons or the information commons, is of course Creative Commons. And as you know, Creative Commons developed this new licensing regime, which is Creative Commons Signals, which basically is an effort for content creators to signal their preferences as it relates to how they want their data to be accessed for AI, right? And there are kind of two signals that Creative Commons has kind of standardized. One signal is how do you want your data and your content to be attributed, right? Because the big concern is that there's a lot of data and content being sucked up by AI without attribution, right? And so they can say, well, actually, it's okay for you to use my content, but we want to have adequate attribution. And the second kind of signal that Creative Commons has been looking into is to also have some kind of remuneration, right? So they can say, okay, so it's okay to use my content, but I want have anyway some financial return, or I designate a nonprofit to receive a financial contribution if you start using my content. So these are kind of the signals. Now, turns out that as they in that article where Creative Commons basically took stock, turns out that this might not be enough. And so they also now, Creative Commons is looking into other ways, as they said, to strengthen information commons. And that includes ways to prevent access to the data commons. And this is a big deal because Creative Commons has always worked on making sure that you have access, right? It was always the idea to make as much access as possible. But as you can see, there's a massive backlash, including in the open knowledge community, to actually make sure that it's not just open and then extracted. And so that's kind of a clear signal. Now, there are other efforts like Noodle is a new licensing regime for African languages, because one of the developments as a result of large language models is where language has now become valuable data, right? And so most large language models, right? That's why it's called language models, need access to language data in order to, of course, improve their models or to extend their models to new languages. And in Africa, there's a clear concern that their language and African languages will be extracted, right? So this would be kind of the new data colonization that is happening, where language is extracted and the communities don't have benefit from that language. It's actually the commercial and corporate AI developers that are benefiting from being able to extract that language. And so in Africa, they developed a Noodle license, which is basically a way to licensing access to African languages, and it involves a pricing scheme, right? So it's licensing plus pricing, so that you basically says, okay, you can have access to our data, but then you need to pay a price. And again, this is kind of an ongoing development where we see where data is where it becomes a negotiation, right, with regard to who has access for what purpose and at what price. And we will see, my hunch is we will see a lot more activity in the licensing space, and a data steward, of course, is going to be crucial to be able to negotiate that space in terms of having access to data, but also in terms of then setting conditions for access that includes having to pay for some of that. If it's a commercial application, for instance, or if it's for research, you could have a different kind of pricing schedule, of course, as well. Now, while we see a decline in access, while we see new ways of negotiating access through, for instance, new licensing regimes or through new technical means to control access to data, we also have seen quite a lot of interesting developments where new data access platforms have been developed. And this one is of interest perhaps also for a broader community here. So this is the Network Science Institute, which, by the way, at the moment has its conference in Boston, basically creating a new data platform to provide access to mobility data for communities. And so this is very high quality mobility data that you can have access to, then develop models for urban planning, for instance. And so this is a really interesting development. I mean, they've been using mobility data for coming up with new models, right, for urban planning, for being able to understand how cities are operating. And they now also provide access to some of their mobility data under, of course, a licensing regime that indicates that that can be happening for research purposes. Other interesting guide that I felt might be interesting and inspirational for some on the call was a guide that was developed in the US by UC Berkeley, and also those that are concerned with regard to making sure that federal data is still accessible. And so it's called the Federal Data Field Guide, which is very nicely done because it actually gives you an introduction in different kinds of data. And I feel like this should be many countries would actually benefit from having kind of a data field guide to know what is the data that exists in their country. And so if you look at this, so it goes about, anyway, what is the statistical data, what data exist, then you can look into kind of what is the context, have a particular kind of case studies about statistical data, have examples, but then administrative data, what exists, geospatial data, have a few case studies, of examples: scientific data, how do you get scientific data, and accountability data, how you go about, like for instance, data that gets um, 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 SNAP, food stamps, and then evaluation data as well. Now, at GovLab, we are planning this summer, if you're interested, developing a similar kind of field guide because I felt like it was quite inspirational on non-traditional data, where we can actually see what are kind of types of non-traditional data that exist and where can you have them as well. So anyway, great example, and perhaps it might be an example that is inspirational, right? So how would that look like? A data guide, for instance, in Switzerland or a data guide in Germany might be interesting to have as well. Now, in addition to that, there are other uh, um, data platforms that have been launched. This is another interesting one, which is in the UK. As you know, they've been launching this initiative called Smart Data, which is basically non-traditional data, like retail data, like mobile phone data. And so now they are actually also have a data catalog that they are launching in order to have access to non-traditional data, like for instance, in this case, property rentals, or synthetic electric vehicle charging sessions, so that you can actually use this to understand the anyway how electric vehicles are being used, and then spending data as well. Now, it's still very limited, but and it's a beta service, but at least I think it's worthwhile looking into it. And again, it could become an inspirational element for other countries to start developing smart data catalogs. And then the last one that I selected for you guys is here uh, AI for Science from Hugging Face, which is another interesting data platform. I think there have about 100 no, 450 data sets that are accessible. And of course, this is mainly for science, but at the same time, I thought it was kind of an interesting way to show that despite the fact that we have a data winter, there are also positive developments where data sets are becoming available for science purposes, for urban planning purposes, for research purposes as well. So these are some of the ones that you may want to look at as well. And then the last example I want to share here is also a research paper that basically looks at Article 40 from the DSA. So as you know, or might know, Article 40 basically provides access to platform data in Europe. And so this paper basically looks into how researchers and others can now also actually have access to platform data for research purposes as well, which I think is very important. But again, we will see whether this remains under the current digital omnibus kind of efforts in Europe. And more importantly, we will see to what extent actually the platforms such as Google or others are actually complying with this provision, which basically says that they have to provide access to their data, right? So it's going to be interesting to see. Now, the other big topics, which of course many of you have followed, is again sovereignty, right? And so sovereignty is not going away. And what we see, and this was this week, a constant efforts to provide new frameworks to ensure that dependencies are not being weaponized. And so when we think about tech sovereignty, from my perspective, and I'm writing a piece about that, and I will give a presentation next week as well on this. From my perspective, digital sovereignty or tech sovereignty basically relates to kind of three concerns. The first concern is, of course, the concern of weaponization of strategic dependence, right? So you're dependent on an infrastructure, that now can be weaponized in terms of, for instance, not having access to it, or in terms of anti-competitive behavior, so that your own domestic industry has no equal footing, for instance, in the market. But also, for instance, more and more, of course, from national security concerns, or even concerns on how a democracy works, right? So if you're dependent on a infrastructure that to publish your laws, and suddenly that infrastructure gets tampered with in a weaponized manner, and you suddenly lose all your official laws, then you have a problem, right, as a country. And so what we see happening is a lot of effort to decrease the dependency on infrastructure that might be that could be weaponized, or that might create new vulnerabilities. And the second kind of concern with sovereignty is for extraction purposes, right? So they can say, well, okay, so if we are weaponization of openness, right? So if we are open, then it can be extracted. And the third concern is, of course, concerned with regard to asymmetries, power asymmetries, or agency asymmetries. So these are kind of the three typical concerns that quite often get confused, right, when they talk about sovereignty. But Europe now has launched this week this new framework on tech sovereignty, which is mainly dealing with the first concern, right? Which is about how do we prevent potential weaponization of infrastructure, right? Weaponization of dependencies. And so what they have announced, and by the way, this still needs to be approved, but it's a framework. They've announced a few initiatives. Including, for instance, they have the CHIPS Act in order to prevent weaponization of dependency on chips, right? So if you're dependent on chip manufacturing outside of your country, that means that anyway, one day you might lose access to chips, which might be highly problematic if you want to compete on CPU, for instance, right? Or you want to compete on computational memory, right? They also have the Cloud and AI Development Act, again, to prevent dependency on access to cloud. They also have the open source strategy, because one way to prevent dependencies is to stimulate open source, right? So that you actually have an open source ecosystem that is more accessible, that you can leverage as well. And then they also have a roadmap for digitalization and AI in energy as well. And so these are kind of all efforts to strengthen technological sovereignty in Europe. And as I said, our efforts to mainly deal with the first concern, which is weaponization of strategic dependencies. My view, which I'm writing about, is that they should also not ignore the other concerns, but somehow they've emphasized the first concern, and which, from my perspective, what they don't focus on is then the agency asymmetries, which I think requires also a focus on digital self-determination, not just digital sovereignty, but how do you make sure that citizens, residents actually also have a certain level of self-determination to determine how their data, how the technology is being designed as well. But Europe has decided to mainly focus on the first concern, not the digital self-determination aspect as well. Now, as it relates to digital self-determination, and as it relates to concerns with regard to extraction, we see a lot of activity, and that's another big part of what I'm working on right now, is how do we ensure also sovereignty for indigenous communities, right? Meaning, especially as it relates to indigenous languages, there are about 4,000 or more, right, indigenous languages that are at risk of disappearing, and that also are increasingly extracted, right? And so how can you make sure that indigenous languages monitor and control their language, and also control their cultural artifacts? And there's a lot of developments in that space. Here are two examples, one from New Zealand, the other one that was just released in Australia. which is kind of new ways to kind of set up secure environments for controlling and managing access to indigenous languages as well. And from my perspective, they are kind of in the lead. And I think we can actually learn a lot from what's happening in indigenous data commons on how that might apply to other kind of stewardship functions, right? Because ultimately this is about stewarding data in compliance with community preferences and expectations as well. Then other developments with regard to data stewardship. There was a paper that was published by Rima Patel, which basically examines all kinds of metaphors and models as it relates to data. And we have data colonization, we have data monetization, and ultimately came to a conclusion that data stewardship is the paradigm that is the most applicable to today's society and also the most actionable when it comes to stewarding data in alignment with the public interest. And so a very interesting paper that again emphasizes this notion of stewardship. But the other element that I have here is also that stewardship could also go, and it's very important to make sure that it's done proper. Typically, the UK Biobank has been seen as kind of the pinnacle of stewarding data for research. Unfortunately, what happened is that a few of their employees have started selling that data to China. And so the whole trust in the biobank as a data steward is now out of the window, unfortunately. And it will take a lot of time to kind of rebuild trust in having people donate their data to the biobank for research. Now that we see that stewardship could also be easily lost as well. So these are a few developments that I thought would be good for this community to be aware of, both in terms of new methods to measure value, of course, developments that again indicate a further decline of access to data, but also elements and developments that shows that there are increasingly new methods and new platforms as well to have access to data. And then, of course, some developments as it relates to data sovereignty. The last part is always propaganda, where we share a few papers that might be relevant for you that the GovLab and the Data Tank have been working on. One paper that we published was about non-traditional data in pandemic preparedness. And I recently wrote a blog this week on also the fact that what happens as it relates to the hantavirus, as you all know, that occurred at a cruise ship, but now also Ebola, that a lot of the lessons that we unfortunately learned during the COVID pandemic, we've forgotten, and we actually are in a worse situation than we were a few years ago, which also can be seen in how we deal with Ebola, which unfortunately was too late identified because there was a lack of data, non-traditional data. And also we saw that with the hantavirus, that actually the whole pandemic preparedness system is basically collapsing as we speak, unfortunately, as well. Then other elements, one piece that I wrote was around context loop, because from my perspective, what's happening in generative AI is that Gen AI is collecting more and more context about individuals, about organizations, because the quality of the response depends on how much context you feed the system, right? And what we see is becoming, anyway, it becomes kind of a dependency, and it also leads to what I call potentially cognitive surrender, right? So where we see, well, now you know everything about me because I feed all the context to you. Now I don't even have to think anymore. But what it also means is that you will have increased lock-in, right? Because and some of you might already have experienced that. Anyway, depending on what generative AI tool you use, well, you keep using the same tool because the same tool already has all your context. And so why would you go to another one if you then have to feed it again, right? Because it becomes, instead of prompt engineering, it becomes context engineering. And so this is kind of what's happening. And so from my perspective, context data is becoming the new frontier of privacy, is becoming the new area where we should start looking into how do we create some boundaries on it. The other one here is a data tank paper. As you know, we've been looking into the how media content is being extracted, right? Which then has negative impact on the viability of media, especially small and medium-sized media outlets. Because why would you go to the media outlet if you have the same contact on via Gen AI? And it, of course, has an impact on the viability, has impact on audiences. And so this is kind of a lit review here. And then two other pieces that I recently wrote that might be of interest. One is, of course, the Magnifica Humanitas, which was written by the Pope in order to basically emphasize the need for humanity at the time of AI. Now, I highly recommend reading it because not because of its coming from the Pope, but because it ultimately is kind of a good piece where they reintroduce values, and of course where it also the connection with peace is being made. And so that's why I wrote this piece. Why anyway, this is actually a really good basis for peace tech, which is another field that I'm working on. And then the last piece is really about data centers, because as you all know, one of the big topics when it comes to AI and where everyone has a concern, especially in the US, is kind of the creation of data centers, right? Like in Virginia, there's a really big concern on how data centers are being established. And basically, the argument I make together with Claudia is that in order to develop data centers, they're going to have to document the social license, which is similar to kind of what happens in the mining industry, right? The extractives industry, where you actually have to document the social license. And as you all know, a social license is a really important element for data stewardship as well. So you can actually document that you have a social license for reusing data as well. So that's it for this month. I hope this provided some